Yeah, I think we are recording now. Perfect. So, very warm welcome to the 20th talk of the Medical Humanities Colloquy, which we started in the middle of COVID. And I think it's a convergence, but I think it's a convergence that is significant enough because in some sense, the pandemic made us realize how the entire question of medical culture and its public ramifications are integrally related to various questions, starting from political discourse to social discourse. Literary discourse has always been there, in a sense, in that interdisciplinary clustering of medical humanities and literature in terms of the discussions on clinical communication and so on and so forth. So, we've had a range of talks in this series for more than a couple of years now, and I'm so glad that even though we've become a little bit more irregular, also due to the paucity of finding medical humanists, especially in the Indian context and scenario, I'm happy that we are back this semester. And we are back, and I'm very happy to have my friend Dr. Jeremy Colangelo here, who will talk about his book, his monograph, and it'll be a book talk. And it's also, I think, quite significant that perhaps for the first time in this series, we will be talking at some length about embodiment, the idea of embodiment and corporeality as a sort of framing in literature through medical humanities. So I think that's also going to be a new area of discussion from the point of view of the series. And I'm happy to see people trickling in. What I'll do, just give me a second, is I'll collapse the waiting room now. Uh, just give me. Yeah. Right, perfect. So we will now, let me just introduce Dr. Colangelo here. Uh, Dr. Jeremy Colangelo is the author or editor of 3 books, including Diaphanous Bodies, Ability, Disability, and Modernist Irish Literature, and the collection Joyce Writing Disability. Since 2019, he has been a sessional lecturer at the University of Western Ontario, where he teaches English disability studies, gender studies, and creative writing. And from 2020 to 2022, he was an SSHRC post-doctoral fellow at SUNY Buffalo. Jeremy's current research project, called Agony for Others on Literature and Pain, studies the role of pain in literary texts and the manner in which pain representation affects and is affected by structures of oppression. And Jeremy's talk today is titled Tempestuously Able-Bodied, the Diaphanous Body and Modernist Literature. Over to you, Jeremy. I'll just share the screen.
Thank you very much, Arka, and thank you everyone for coming to see my talk today. I'm very happy to have a chance to present my work to you and to contribute to the important research being done here. My book, Diaphanous Bodies, falls generally within the bounds of disability studies and makes extensive use of disability theory, but disability itself is better understood as a prominent secondary concern. The primary issue instead is the construction of ability, discursively, socially, narratively, formally, phenomenologically, and so forth, as principally instantiated in the work of 4 key modernist Irish authors: James Joyce, Samuel Beckett, George Egerton, and Elizabeth Bowen, each of whom is the subject of one of the book's chapters. My investigation centers on a single mythical figure, that of the diaphanous abled body, which at its most basic level is an ideological formation to which the discourse of ability continuously refers and upon which the notion of ability is grounded. It is a transparent body, one that does not participate in the act of sensation, serving as a perfectly clear window through which the world may pass towards the supposedly rational and self-sufficient mind. Yet it is more also than a belief in a lack of obstruction. For, as the book lays out, ability presumes also a transparency of subject position and of narrative position, such that the body in question is deemed to have no restriction or specificity in terms of its location, narrative focal point, social relation, or temporality. In short, The diaphanous abled body is the fantasy of having a body that bears no trace of its embodiment. It is a mythical body that feels no pain and brooks no weakness. To be diaphanous is thus to be a person without qualities, lacking both identifiable characteristics as well as the specifying vectors of time and place. And by way of comparison, as Sarah Ahmed writes, quote, "The emergence of the idea of sexual orientation does not position the figures of the homosexual and the heterosexual in a relation of equivalence. Rather, it is the homosexual who's constituted as having an orientation. The heterosexual would be presumed to be neutral." Anyone who has followed the history of queer activism has likely heard the ignorant refrain, "I'm not straight, I'm normal." A basic sentiment that we can see recurring not only in responses to disability activism, "I'm not abled," but also in related situations such as the struggle for transgender rights, "I'm not cis." In positing themselves as the norm from which the stigmatized person deviates, as well as an epistemologically neutral and therefore dominant because unbiased subject, a person claiming a non-marginalized identity must reject the fact of having an identity at all. Instead, they transform the taxonomic act of reciprocal naming, "I am this and you are that," into a diagnostic act of listing disorders compared to which the healthy, normal subject need not be explicitly named. "You're like that because you're wrong somehow," is the way the logic is phrased. No person on earth or in fiction actually fulfills these qualifications. No one is totally without obstruction. No one is totally without limitation. And yet many people consider themselves abled, or as they might instead put it, consider themselves non-disabled, despite the fact that they do in fact have these sorts of physical weaknesses and physical limitations. So the simplest operative definition of abled person might therefore be someone whose social and physical characteristics are such that they do not consider themselves disabled and are not considered disabled by others. Or more pithily, an abled person is a person whose limitations are not stigmatized. There are many actions that are technically within the scope of human capacity, but which the majority of people cannot ever do. It's see somebody who can memorize hundreds of digits of pi or run at super high speeds or, solve impossibly difficult math equations. These are all things that people, broadly speaking, can do in the sense that at least one person has done each of them. But it's very few people can do these things. And yet there is an underlying assumption that abled is aligned with optimal, that the way in which a non-disabled person performs some task, be it lifting, thinking, running, perceiving, amounts to more or less the best way that task can be performed. An assumption that obscures the broader spectrum of capacity, compared to which the ability-disability binary simply makes no sense and is incomplete. Now slide. As Tobin Siebers writes, within the ideology of ability, which is his term, quote, "The body seems both inconsequential and perfectible, such that if one is able-bodied, one is not really aware of the body. One feels the body only when something goes wrong with it. And yet things are always going wrong with the body, with anyone's body, all the time. The limitations of the abled are omnipresent and yet never recognized as such, and the accommodations they receive are offered silently. People pull out their phones to calculate the tip at a restaurant or hold on to a railing as they walk upstairs and never recognize how these everyday prosthetics exist on a continuum with wheelchairs and braille. It seems to me then a mistake to rest definitions of disability on the kind or extent of limitation required, for if disability occurred at once with limitation, all people would be in some sense disabled. Likewise, it is not only a matter of disability occurring with especially extreme limitations, or with, as the social model of disability describes, serious limitations that have been denied accommodation or social support. Plenty of people have problems that seriously impair them every day, but which neither they nor the people around them identify as disabling, or as a disability. There is an under-addressed liminal space between being a disabled person without suitable accommodations and being an abled person who needs no accommodations, and that ideally abled person is really just a construct. Wherein a person's, but this liminal space wherein a person's impairments go unaddressed without said person ever being considered by themselves or others to be disabled. Right? What are these people, if any of them? As I show, the particular form of the stigmatization applied to differences considered disabling arises from a relation to an unspoken concept of ability. My argument in its most simple form is that ability is not simply the negative image of disability, defined and understood through the negation of its other, that is to say, ability defined as not being disabled, but rather it is a positive category in its own right, one based on the myth of the diaphanous abled body. This phantom body, in turn, is the foundation for depictions of ability in literary works, affecting both their content and their form. The myth of the diaphanous abled body is not the belief that I have an ability and therefore am abled because of it. Rather, it is a means of sidestepping or pushing out of one's mind the omnipresence of weakness and limitation. Notions of the social construction of disability have long had difficulty with certain kinds of disability, such as chronic pain, and seem resistant to non-ontological explanations for disabling. The question, though, is not of the presence or non-presence of pain, discomfort, or lack of access, but rather how certain kinds of limitations are categorized. Everyone is limited to one extent or another. What the notion of disability does is transforms a difference of degree, the wide yet continuous gulf between one person's occasional discomfort and another person's utter agony, into a difference in kind. This transformation is both how disability and ability, as related yet distinct categories, are created. It is the drawing of a line arbitrarily to divide two random sections of humanity into different halves. The unspoken goal for someone who wants to retain their status as abled is to deny and disguise the markers of continuity they share with those on the other side of the division. And it is in these terms that the construction of ability is adjudicated. So I take the term, to bring the modernism into this discussion, I take the term diaphanous from the opening section of the Proteus episode of James Joyce's Ulysses. And that's on the next slide there. So as the opening passage goes, ineluctable modality of the visible, at least that, if no more, thought through my eyes, signatures of all things I am here to read, sea spawn and sea wreck, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, snot green, blue silver, rust, colored signs, limits of the diaphane. And that's from Proteus. That's when Stephen Daedalus is walking down the Sandy Mount Strand and thinking to himself in his extremely pretentious Aristotelian way, for those of you who haven't read Ulysses recently. Anyway, according to Gifford and Seidman's annotations for this passage, the use of the word diaphane, which designates a transparent substance, something is diaphanous if usually light easily passes through it and you can sort of see through it. And this usage comes from Aristotle's writing on the senses in De Anima, his text on the soul, and De Sensu Sensibili, which is about the senses and the sensible. In the latter, Aristotle writes that transparency or translucency is, quote, not something peculiar to air or water or any of the other bodies usually called translucent, but is a common nature and power, capable of no separate existence of its own, but residing in them and subsisting likewise in all other bodies in a greater or lesser degree. It is therefore the translucent, according to the degree in which subsists in bodies, that causes them to partake in color. This passage has many resonances that make diaphanousness a useful masterword of ability. It is everywhere, and everywhere subtends or influences the presentation of an object's color, yet it is also defined by its invisibility. No object is ever completely transparent, Not even the air in front of one's eyes allows the light to travel through it without being slightly modified or redirected. And in the next slide, as we also see in Aristotle's De Anima, quote, "It is the colorless that is receptive of color, and the soundless of sound. And the transparent is colorless, and so is the invisible or the scarcely visible, as, for example, the dark seems to be." Transparency for Aristotle is like the canvas upon which the paint of coloration is applied, the ideal medium of vision, just as silence is the ideal medium of sound. One way to think of the perceiving subject in the way Aristotle might have imagined them is to see the objects of perception, color, sound, flavor, etc., as disruptions in an even plane of void, such as the first requirement of any perceived thing is that it be other than emptiness. As the philosopher Anna Maramedoro writes, quote, "The perceptible qualities are, for Aristotle, causal powers such that causation is to be accounted for in terms of powers and their activation," which means that these sensible entities, quote, "are real powers of the object to interact causally with the perceivers." And perception itself is the activation of the relevant powers in the perceiver by the object of perception. So basically, Aristotle's advance here is conceiving of perception as a causal relationship between an object and a perceiving subject, is sort of what that translates into. The diaphane is thus a potent metaphor. It underlies every instance of sensation, yet is never directly sensed. Its effects are great, but indirect. It is a rule that can only ever be observed in the breaching, a law understood through transgression. In Ulysses, this role has it serving as an eraser of distinction. When Stephen, thinking to himself, gives a list of objects, sea spawn and sea wreck, the nearing tide, that rusty boot, he is for just a moment seeing things not as objects, but rather as limits on an all-pervasive diaphane. It is this motion that suggested the use of the word as a key term for disability studies. The objects are seen only as the divergences from an invisible and impossible norm. A norm, that is, which can never be normal in the full sense of the term, for it is rare to the point of being non-existent. The objects are degraded in the relation, losing their singularity as they become simply adiaphanous smudges. The act is thus a phenomenological reduction of the view from nowhere, one which adopts and tries to understand a subjective experience that Stephen cannot have any concept of. And, I think it's very interesting that later in the same chapter, Stephen asks what it's like to be blind and tries to simulate that by closing his eyes and walking with his cane outstretched, as though that actually simulates anything. But it's this fundamental misrecognition that is at the heart of the diaphanous abled body. The subsequent intellectual history of vision provides some insights into how this pattern of thought plays out when it comes to the construction of ability. Not yet. For Aristotle, sight is abled sight. The diaphane is inflected with color that is then perceptible by a purely hypothetical observer whose body is itself diaphanous, unmarked by disability. As I go on to analyze in my book's first chapter, this pattern reappears in the work of Descartes, whose optics treats vision as abled vision and sees disabled or impaired sight as arising from disruptions in the normal, supposedly optimal way of seeing. Though the optic spends quite a lot of time on the physics and mathematics of corrective lenses, and by extension on the improvement and enhancement of vision through prosthetic devices, it nevertheless performs the maneuver I sketched out above, where the logic of the diaphanous body allows both extraordinary and strategically allows both extraordinary and statistically average capacity to be bound together under the label of normal vision. Even his chapter on telescopes, which enhance the sight of people with 20/20 vision, begins with a discussion of, quote, those who cannot see objects at some distances as well as close ones, as though the enhancement of healthy vision can only be justified in relation to disability. Instead of conceiving of the capacity to see as arising in a variety of forms and degrees, resulting in a spectrum of ability where no simple division between abled and disabled could be drawn. Descartes instead considers it a kind of plateau, such that if one is brought up to it, one can go no higher. The abled body, in possession of true and untroubled vision, thus sits as the sole accurate source of visual knowledge and the arbiter of objectivity. One underlying assumption which gives rise to this framework is that the eye participates minimally in the act of seeing, which is to say that the body participates minimally in the act of seeing, because Descartes is a dualist with respect to the mind. It is this very question that Stephen is considering when he evokes Aristotle, both the physical process of light entering the eye and also the questions of physical and narrative point of view that lend the matter further complexity. In that sense, he differs greatly from the approach of Isaac Newton, who in a notebook entry describing his observations on the physics of color produced this handy illustration on the next slide, depicting an experiment he performed, which involved deforming one of his own eyes with a bodkin, which is a type of large blunt sewing needle. And this manuscript page, along with the rest of Newton's notebooks, is available. It's been digitized at the Cambridge University Library, so you can just look it up there if you want to see this in the in the flesh, so to speak. Anyway, as his notebook entry describes, the result of this experiment was that the compression of his eye caused Newton to see several colored circles. And on the diagram there, you can see how he sort of labeled different parts of the compression and said this is where the circles were relative to it. And he's strangely mathematical for someone who's done this to himself. But anyway, and in this way, he demonstrated, it says that the compression of his eye caused Newton to see several colored circles. And in this way, he demonstrated that the eye does indeed participate in the perception of color, instead of being merely a transparent medium. It is a rebuke also to the Cartesian position that, quote, it is the mind which sees, not the eye, and it can see immediately only through the intervention of the brain, end quote. For if the eye does not participate in vision, why would modifying the eye create new sights and new colors that weren't there before? As Oliver Darrigal describes, Newton's work on optics represents a shift in the understanding of light and color away from, quote, the scholastic concept of light as the multiplication of intentional species through a medium, and towards more atomist understandings, end quote, atomist understandings of light and visual transmission that were more congenial to the mechanistic physics of, that Newton preferred. The atomist approach to vision is, of course, quite different from what arises from the Aristotelian tradition, and it opens up the possibility that the eye, being a transit point for light, could affect one's vision in some way, even when that vision is not disabled. So, you know, there's no question of abled being just vision, and then disabled vision is when the body gets in the way of seeing. The body is always in the way of seeing, or it's always allowing you to see. It's always participating in seeing. Is the distinction that I'm trying to point to here. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I lost my place here briefly. There we go. There we go. So the experiment with the bodkin is but one stage in a complex history which I cannot help but greatly simplify. I draw attention to it, though, due to how it serves as an inflection point, where in Newton's understanding of optics, that would go on to overshadow Aristotle and Descartes due to their greater empirical accuracy, nevertheless retains an important pattern in the construction of ability. As Alice Hall, Georgina Klege, and others have noted, description of vision and visual impairment tend frequently to rest definitions of abled normative sight on a more or less stereotyped concept of blindness. And in my first chapter, I actually investigate a lecture that Borges, the author, gave about his own blindness, where he talks about how blindness has gradients and degrees with it. And when you're not just, you know, lights on, lights off. There's he describes seeing as a kind of green mist. But anyway, as Siebers says in the quote above, within the ideology of ability, the body is typically only known through its breaking. such that the abled body becomes an object of knowledge only through great resistance. In this case, Newton attains knowledge relating to the function of vision in general only by deforming his own eye, temporarily incapacitating it, and risking permanent damage. In this manner, he remains part of a long-standing pattern of thought and representation, where disability appears as a punctum in the otherwise smooth and imperceptible medium of the diaphanous body. I should note that the emphasis on vision and optics in the previous bit arises primarily from how commodious this history has proven to be in terms of exemplifying and articulating this study's key ideas. Next slide. But the diaphanous body has less to do with perception than it does with epistemology, phenomenology, and the illusion of self-sufficiency, which Emmanuel Levinas, the phenomenologist, in his early work on escape, refers to as the egoism of the bourgeois subject. As he writes, the bourgeois, and I've got a longer version of the quote on the slide there, but as he writes, the bourgeois admits no inner division and would be ashamed to lack confidence in himself, and remains married to an erroneous belief in their self-sufficiency. There is a long history in philosophy of this kind of approach to reason. We see it most famously at the beginning of Descartes' Meditations, where he performs his act of universal doubting, where he says, I'm going to throw away all my preconceptions and start from scratch, as though that's a thing a person could actually do. We see it too in the phenomenological reduction of Husserl, in the opening propositions of Wittgenstein's Tractatus, and relevant to this book's concluding chapter, which discusses the COVID-19 pandemic in relation to social contract theory, in the veil of ignorance, which underpins John Rawls's ethics. Yet this tendency is, I think, best expressed by Merleau-Ponty, where he writes that, quote, if it is true that as soon as philosophy declares itself to be reflection or coincidence, it prejudices what it will find, then once again it must recommence everything, reject the instruments reflection and intuition have provided themselves, and install itself in experiences that have not yet been worked over, and hence give philosophy resources to redefine them. We must ask, what kind of person is being imagined here, or at the start of the Meditations, or in these other philosophical texts? What type of figure are we being asked to envision thinking these thoughts? In these cases, the ideal reasoning subject is considered to have neither presence nor attachments. The perfect philosopher emerges in these sorts of texts as one lacking any knowledge, or especially in Rawls's case, any self-knowledge. The real, fleshy, possibly disabled body of everyday life must, in this line of thinking, be reconstituted, reconstructed cell by cell by the pure force of disincorporated reason. Thus, the diaphanous body becomes the model for the ideal reasoning body, which can never properly be a body, can never properly occupy any specific vantage point or harbor any actual experience, for to do so would be to compromise its claim to privileged and unbiased reason. Merleau-Ponty himself mentions a version of this tendency when he discusses science's what he calls a fundamental bias to treat everything as though it were an object in general. It is a kind of Platonism that much philosophy engages in. When Husserl considers a chair or a table, though he has before him a specific chair or table different from all the other chairs and tables, really what he is interested in is perception in general, the act of encountering some kind of external thing and having to incorporate it by way of perception and reflection. In much the same way that Euclid, for example, is interested in triangles in general, or Socrates is interested in the good in general. This preference for generality ties back to the construction of ability in terms of the normal, in that the search for the mathematical phantom of l'homme moyen, or the average person, results in a person lacking any specific qualities or attributes who is nevertheless held up as typical, despite the fact that nobody lacks qualities or attributes. But no person is a person in general, and no thing is a thing in general. the attempt at philosophical reduction or some other kind of generalizing thought experiment where all preconceptions are lost and all foreknowledge abandoned, thus links back to the ideology of ability in several ways. First, it is an attempt to arrive at an idealized optimal reasoner, or an optimal philosopher, where through the myth of the diaphanous body, this optimization is understood in terms of the removal of specificity. Second, this optimization through unspecificity, carried out in pursuit of generality, includes the destruction or at least occlusion of the subject's specific point of view. Merleau-Ponty is correct in identifying this dislocation with science. When Newton, as the story goes, was hit in the head with a falling apple, his insight was not that this apple in particular has fallen to earth, but that objects generally do so, such that his conclusions could be stated without any reference to his specific subjective experiences. And I would hardly consider such attempts to be always erroneous or misconstrued. Certainly in the sciences, this approach has many benefits. Yet the frequent reliance on this mode of reasoning, even in cases like phenomenology, where the subject's situated particular experience is a matter of direct importance, suggests that there is more than mere intellectual pragmatism at work. This is a habit that has been picked up and is being applied even in cases where it doesn't really make sense when you're thinking about it. This pattern of thought holds that the ideal thinker in all cases is one lacking to the greatest extent possible any attachments, embodiment, or specificity. Next slide. It is much like what Adorno and Horkheimer describe in the Dialectic of Enlightenment when they talk about Odysseus and the sirens in the Odyssey, where Odysseus is, quote, self-assertion, as in all epics, as in civilization as a whole, is in self-denial. An analysis that the disability theorist Leonard Davis reads in terms of the wish of enlightenment thinking to suppress the senses in service of production. And it is telling how often the suppression of the body in the ideal philosopher travels along with images of bodily perfection, such as seen, as is on the slide here, in the muscular body of Socrates in Jacques-Louis Davis's famous painting of his death, where he has to drink the hemlock, with its contrast of the philosopher's reasoned disinterest with the mournful anguish of the people around him. So easily is one ideal of detached reason joined with another ideal of a hypermuscular build. Socrates is so disinterested in the physical and so attached to the ideal and the psychological that he doesn't even care that he's being forced to drink hemlock, but he does go to the gym every day. Because you don't get a body like that for free. And there's a contradiction at play here, just in the painting itself and the way we imagine ideal and, great philosophers, and the way that thinking is supposed to work. And sorry, I knocked over my microphone there because I was gesturing. Anyway, Levinas's egoism is what is at work. And specifically, an egoism grounded on an ideology of ability constructed in relation to the diaphanous able-bodied. And one worry I have regarding my use of the word diaphanous, or similar words like transparent, is that it might suggest an ideal of ability that the ideal of ability is like a human made of glass, carrying all the usual limbs, organs, and dimensions of some imagined abled person, but with a body that in no way interposes between the world and their agency or sensation. This simplified glass body model of ability can apply and be useful in some cases, but it is otherwise too simple and too limited. Instead, we should imagine, as I've tried to suggest with this philosophical discussion above, that for the egoism of ability to even have a body at all is too much. If ableism can be said to have any central creed at all, it is the rejection of weakness, and the body is the throne of weakness, especially one's own body. And one of the chief weaknesses of the body is its locality, its specificity, as well as its dependence on others. I can only be in one place at one time. I can only see and experience and hear and smell and feel and so forth the things that are in that place. And all of my senses are centered on and limited by that location. Likewise, in my later chapters, I relate this to narrative point of view and how it relates to the construction of, prose and descriptions and whatnot. Likewise, am I only able to survive due to the labor of others? Labor that is often invisible to me. I didn't make this shirt myself. I didn't make this computer myself. I didn't, wherever this water in this cup came from, I have no idea. It just came out of my tap. And this is true in one way or another for everyone. Thus, the ideology of ability, when followed to its logical endpoint, rejects the notion that the body simply extends or mediates the mind or the will, and instead imagines thinking and desiring as ideally disembodied acts. It is in this sense, then, that the pervasiveness suggested by Aristotle's use of the word diaphane must be kept in mind. We're almost done. Next slide. Levinas makes a remark to this effect early in Totality and Infinity, where he writes that a person's needs, quote, constitute them as the same and not as dependent on the other. My body is only a way for the subject to be reduced to slavery, to depend on what is not itself, but is also a way of possessing and of working, of having time, of overcoming the very alterity of what I have to live from. The body is the very self-possession by which the I, liberated from the world by need, succeeds in overcoming the very destitution of this liberation. So what Levinas means by need here has to do with the complex way that a subject acknowledges yet pulls away from its essential dependence on what is not itself. In that the very requirement that one eat, for instance, evidences one's lack of self-sufficiency. So basically, Levinas is saying you relate to others in some sense by the fact that you need things, by the fact that you're limited, by the fact that you need to eat and are not perfectly self-sufficient in creating your own energy. As Levinas says slightly earlier, achieving happiness arises from the accomplishment of a need, in that, quote, it exists, happiness, quote, exists in a soul satisfied and not in a soul that has extirpated his needs, end quote. That is to say, the denial of need, or more accurately, the reduction of the body to a needless thing in a process of physical and psychological aestheticism, though reducing one's dependence on others, does not result in pleasure or a sense of well-being, which instead arises from the fulfillment of those needs and by extension of embracing one's relation to the other. In my book's later chapters, I explore some of the second and third order effects of the denial of this embrace that has its roots in the construction of the body within capitalism, insofar that the ideology of capital demands workers who have minimized or eliminated their needs, becoming as much like interchangeable automations and machine parts as possible. And how this demand that holds up the diaphanous body as the ideal worker's body, in addition to the ideal philosopher's body, intertwines with other complex social processes. My chapter on George Edgerton talks about, the construction of gender, and my chapter on Elizabeth Bowen talks about the diaphanous body in relation to the colonization and decolonization of Ireland. The goal in these chapters is not to run disability through the sieve of class reductionism. Rather, it is a recognition of the fact that a history of capital and ability has yet to be written. And its completion, I think, would be of great benefit to disability studies generally, to see how the construction of a capitalist society creates and implies a certain concept of ability and a certain concept of disability. Yet, absent that work, the role of capitalism's uncompromising demand that all people, save perhaps the owners of capital, reduce themselves to perfectly needless automations, such that the extraction of labor can proceed without impediment, is too ever-present to go without remark. Even in the Levinas passage quoted above, we can see an echo of this demand. The egoism of the bourgeois subject, the wish for self-sufficiency to the point of self-destruction and the denial of all pleasure, these patterns do not come from nothing. For while capital sees the individual person's needs as costs that must be reduced in the name of profit maximization, this framework is in fact alien to the way that the subject experiences need, in that it is not a cost or a drag on profiteering, but a foundation for the way that the subject relates to and is enriched by the other. Thus, in addition to the way that the myth of Diaphanous Body rejects the construction of the world through the body via the senses, the subject's limited point of view, or the myriad other ways that weakness and specificity serve to create what phenomenologists call the life world of the subject, the myth is also, finally, a font of self-deception. It should be easy to imagine how the flattering lies of self-sufficiency serve to create precisely this state. Perhaps I read Descartes and his description of what he claims to be his total doubtfulness, and I see the usefulness that this position has for him. Perhaps I come to see myself as a good philosopher, like Descartes or Wittgenstein or Plato or whoever, and who rejects all presumptions, and, like Joseph Conrad's Kurtz, has kicked myself loose of the earth and all its limitations. But of course, Kurtz, like all colonizers, considers himself most self-sufficient at the moment he is most weak and most dependent, in much the same way that 19th century England, gorging on the wealth of its many colonies, was swaddled also in fatuous narratives of self-reliance peddled by the likes of Horatio Alger, Samuel Smiles, and their various fellow travelers. To believe oneself to be abled is to believe in a harsh division between ability and disability, which simply does not exist, to make a binary out of a spectrum, and therefore to embrace self-deception. And you can go to the last slide now, Arca. So thank you very much for listening to me today. I've got my works cited page up on the board there, and I look forward to all of your questions, which I'm sure will be fascinating and highly detailed.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful. And I'm sure there'll be many questions. I'll just maybe just begin with a few remarks. Maybe that'll give the audience members some time to gather their thoughts. It was very interesting, especially, I mean, I'm just in a way recasting what you said in a slightly different language. But what struck me in the talk was the way you talked about ableism itself as a as a kind of disavowal of the body, as it were, where the body is idealized into non-existence, as it were. The myth of the diaphanous body and the way it helped kind of deconstruct the binary of ability and disability, right? And the philosopher's body idealized into that diaphene, the laborer's body, the idea of the colonial and the decolonial, their egoism and the body, and the way you went through Aristotle, Joyce, Levinas, in a way, the whole spectrum. It also made me think, in some sense, I mean, coming out of my own interest in psychoanalysis, how the mirror stage body is fundamentally ableist because there is a misrecognition of the body as a complete totality, as it were.
Yes.
So then it gets undercut by two things. One is that it sort of misrecognizes the ego as the subject, which is why it kind of falls through the cracks in a sense. And it also, is sort of, at least in Lacan's first figuration, there is someone else who's propping up the body, because it's the body of a baby between 6 and 18 months. It can barely walk. It has to be propped up in front of the mirror. So there's a social other there. There's a social other, right?
And to sort of bring in the phenomenology a bit, I've often been thinking of Heidegger's example of the broken hammer, where you notice the hammer when it breaks in relation to the body. Very common situation that happens with people with chronic illnesses or chronic disabilities or whatnot is that they become experts in whatever it is that's wrong with them, often to the point where they're telling their doctors, hey, I heard about this study, maybe you can get me involved in this because there's a medication that I can't get otherwise. And that happens for a couple of reasons. One of them is that when I don't, for example, I'm not subjectively experiencing my appendix right now. I couldn't even tell you where it is because I haven't read Grey's Anatomy in forever. But you know, if it burst, I think I would be able to tell you exactly where it was pretty immediately. So there is this sort of subjective kind of disintegration that happens through pain, discomfort, illness.
mm,
Yeah, that's purely subjective, but also that sudden breaking of the wholeness of your body then creates a certain kind of both a necessity to do research and a
mm,
curiosity which compels that research. You
right.
know, it's I had, just to again use a personal example, I had a tendonitis in my rotator cuff because I was practicing piano and my technique was terrible and I hurt myself. And now I know way more about how the rotator cuff works than I did prior to this, because suddenly I'm like, well, hang on, how does this bunch of muscles in my shoulder actually function? But where
Right.
was that curiosity before?
Mm. So
Where was,
medical
yeah,
condition as a kind of activation of the body, as it were.
yes. And now I'm like, oh yeah, now I've got this stuff. And then there's this muscle that controls this and this muscle that controls that. And now it's interesting to me in a way that it, I guess, wasn't before.
Right.
And, you know, that I think connects with the mirror stage. You know, you see yourself as a whole,
Right.
and you have to be reintroduced to the concept of the body as a collection of parts. You're basically just a really
Right.
complex ongoing chemical reaction.
Mm. Yeah, and in fact, that's where ultimately one would go with the body in the real as a sort of fragment. The body in the real is always a fragment in psychoanalysis. And which brings me to a quick question, if I may, and I'll then open it up to the floor. So, because it's almost like a critical commonplace to say that modernist literature has so much corporeal fragmentation as a sort of, larger predicament. Sometimes it's seen existentially, sometimes it has a very specific sociocultural implication. I was just wondering this idea of corporeal fragmentation, how an acknowledgement of corporeal fragmentariness could be a sort of critique of ableism. Do you think a
Mhm.
sort of acknowledgement of one's frail body, in
Yeah.
certain sense, could deconstruct this ableism?
Yes, and in fact, the title of my talk is sort of alluding to that. There's a slogan, and you know, probably people here have probably heard this before. That one is only temporarily able-bodied. You know, you will eventually be sick, you will eventually be old, you will eventually get injured, etc., etc. And you know, I changed that to tempestuously because that presumes that a young non-disabled, non-sick person is somehow not experiencing these things. But instead of focusing on how you will become disabled in the future somehow, it I think makes sense also to focus on how are you experiencing your body by way of weakness and limitation today in the present. Just the fact that, you know, just the fact that I can't be in India giving this presentation in person right now is a limitation of my individual, like I am a person, I'm in a spot, and if I want to go somewhere else, I have to travel. And if it's far away, then it takes a long time to travel. And that's a limitation. If you're some kind of idealized floating intelligence, well, you don't have to eat. You don't have to worry about where you're standing. There's the example that Husserl likes, and which I like to take from Husserl, of the coin, and you can only see one side of it at a time. And if you turn it to see the other side, you're hiding the side you were just looking at. That is a limitation. That's not a limitation of the coin. That's a limitation of me as a perceiver.
Right.
Uh, Whereas an ideal, and this is actually, I talk a lot about vision in Joyce's Ulysses, and I talk about ways in which one imagines. I quote, there's a great passage in John Berger's Way of Seeing that talks about this in relation to painting. The way that a European style perspective sort of centers the painting in terms of a particular person who's standing roughly center to the painting and so far away, and that's what all the lines sort of converge on or diverge in relation to. And this creates an impression that your limited point of view is also somehow a God's eye view, that from here, this is the perspective from which, in relation to which everything makes sense. It's a kind of almost pantheism,
Right.
uh, which is itself a non-locality.
Mm. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think this would be perhaps a good opportunity to bring in the audience members. I think you can both chat and unmute yourselves. Both options are open. Please feel free to ask your questions either by unmuting yourself. You could always switch on your video if you like and ask the question, or you could put it in the chat box,
I've
whatever
got
you prefer.
I've got the chat open, so I'll see if anybody
Right,
posts
right.
anything.
Perfect, perfect. Questions, please? You could raise your hand if that is something you prefer. I'll try and I have the gallery view open, so I should be able to see it. There's a raised hand. Yeah, I can see Bharani. Bharani, please go ahead. Yeah, I'll just, yeah, I think you can unmute yourself and speak.
Okay, hi, Arko, and hi. So I just have a small observation. It's a very, very interesting talk,
Thank you.
Jeremy, and it's a I enjoyed. Uh, I just have a small kind of a comment because I mean, particularly your trajectory from Plato to Levinas, kind of, mm, gave a certain uh, narrative about the role of body in philosophy, in the sense body and disembodiment. I mean, embodiment and disembodiment, which is a kind of a recurring theme in philosophy. And I mean, disembodiment has its own, manifestations across different, different phases of the history of philosophy. I have one little suggestion, maybe it's a kind of a suggestion. Uh, Pascal, I mean, Pascal, because uh, I think Pascal has a kind of a very alternative view of the body. I mean, because I think you referred to Descartes, and Pascal had a kind of a very uh, unprecedented sort of a critique of, the mind-body dualism, Cartesian dualism. In that, Pascal actually seems to say that all knowledge is based in body. I mean, affect is the source of, in some sense, knowledge. So um, I would say that, perhaps one could retrieve an alternative, uh, alternative sort of a path in the history of philosophy, which takes off from Pascal and possibly culminates in the existentialist tradition, which kind of places a certain degree of, premium on the body, which the other tradition perhaps doesn't. Perhaps Pascal gets it from his commitment to the religion. I mean, the Hebraic sources. Yeah, I just thought I'll just make this comment. Yeah, thanks.
That's a fantastic suggestion. Thank you very much. It's been ages since I read the Pensée, so I need to go dig up my copy and read it again, apparently, because that sounds really fascinating. Thank you so much. We have was one in the chat room.
Yeah, I think it's a question from Hannah. Let me read it out to you, Jeremy. Yeah. By the way, very happy to see you, Hannah, or see you in Zoom the way we see each other. Okay, so yeah, she says she's in a noisy place, and hence the chat box question. So she says it's a fascinating talk, and I'm wondering how far you see your academic work on disability as connected or not to political disability activism. Yeah.
So, thank you, Hannah. That's a very interesting, it's a very important question. I will say that, in general, disability theory, very much arises from the pre-existing disability activism tradition. There were disability activist movements I'm aware of them in Europe and North America. I'm sure there were in other places as well, prior to disability theory being a thing, and as being a thing really anywhere. And even things like temporarily able-bodied, that started as an activist slogan. The social model of disability, that was created by and for activists to explain their grievances and to justify the things that they were advocating for. So in terms of my integration with it, originally I had planned it to be, but what was interesting is I actually finished writing this book in June of 2020, right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what I ended up actually doing was thinking more in terms that sort of affected my thinking in that it was more connected to how disability relates to the manner in which capitalist society disintegrates people from each other and separates people from each other as a kind of, I'm going to examine how this works and figure it out. I've got that concluding chapter on COVID-19, for example. So I could probably be putting more thought into it, but I've sort of been looking at questions of like, where does that not work? How does that not function? Just sort of drew my attention more during the period I was writing the book.
She might have dropped out of the call, but I think we'll have a recording, so hopefully
Yeah.
she'll be able to sort of, hear your
That's the
response
important
later.
part.
Yeah. So Shruti Sharma has a question, and let me read it out to you, Jeremy. How do loved ones of a person with chronic disease see the limitation in terms of bodies, theirs as well as the sufferers?
That's a very good question, a very complicated question. My first thought would be that, every chronic illness is its own chronic illness. Everybody, like, yes, of course, illnesses, you have this disease and you have that disease, but also, especially when we're talking about a loved one with a chronic illness, that relationship that you have with that person as they're ill is going to be affected by the relationship you had when they were not ill, or maybe less ill. It's, I think, very different taking care of your mother or father with their if they've got a chronic illness, than say if you're taking care of your child, or if you're a nurse, or if you're this or if you're that. So it's my first response to that is I really don't want to generalize. I will say I've got in my third chapter, I've got a sort of analysis of the concept of the deathbed, which, it's the deathbed as a kind of social and political and cultural institution. Most people who have died have not done so in hospital beds, just going across human history. But there's this idea that you go, it's this approach to medicine of keep the patient alive in all circumstances, doesn't matter how awful it is. This resistance that happens in a lot of medical thinking to saying, okay, instead of, you suffering immensely in chemotherapy or whatever, so you can be alive for an extra month or so, we're going to send you to a hostel. That mindset results in death occurring in the place, time, and context of healing and the prevention of death, in that, you end up dying surrounded by doctors and medical equipment, which is, I think, very interesting than, say, dying in a hostel surrounded by your loved ones, or dying in a less medicalized context, as, again, the vast majority of people who have lived and died, humans evolved 100,000 years ago. There's been a lot of us. So, I guess what really comes to my attention then is the specificity of time and place, and of pre-existing relationships. Definitely all fit together, and it's a lot.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point about. I was just thinking about this sort of medicalization of death, and death as an experience and
And
non-medicalized.
also,
Yeah,
something else that I just remembered is, you never really experience your own death.
yeah.
Like, knowledge of what it's like.
Heideggerian terms, right?
Yeah, maybe I'll learn what it's like to die at some point, but then I'll immediately forget because I'm dead. So we learn about death, and again, this is Heidegger again, because I can't escape this person for some reason. You learn about death through the deaths of others. which isn't the same as a chronic illness. But again, if you don't have a chronic illness, you
Mm.
learn about chronic illnesses through the chronic illnesses of others.
Right.
And so it's a understanding that's based on looking at how a person appears from outside, listening to what they say, and then imagining what it's like. You know, if somebody died and came back and asked, and they said what it was like, what would they even say? Well, we can imagine it, but we'll never know.
Mm, mm. And in fact, Heidegger kind of asked that question, right, in Being and Time, that perhaps the death of the other as an experience cannot be an ontological supplementation of the fact that we do not have an experience of our own
Yeah,
death, right? So it's not
exactly.
perhaps as strong an experience. I mean, at least he questions whether it's as strong an experience.
And in a kind of hyper empiricist sense,
Mm.
proves to me that I'm gonna die. Never died before. Since I've been born, I have died 0 times. I am on my first life. But I mean, of course, that argument's ridiculous, but it's only ridiculous because we've seen other people die.
True. Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Great. I think we have another question, so let me read it out from the chat box. Apeksha Srivastava asked, first she says it's great talk, and then she asks, how can different personalities of people connect with ability and disability potentially, and whether we can see them as categories or on a continuum?
Right, that's a very good question. I mean, I'll say I have begun to see categories as very much a sort of a layer that we're applying to the world and a way of categorizing. Categories are a way of categorizing, as a way of organizing and giving names to different chunks of our empirical existence. I don't necessarily see categories as having their own ontology. They're sort of a relational kind of a kludge. And so what one of the things that I've also come to recognize through disability theory is the importance of individual specificity. Every person has a different life history. Every person's personality arises from their particular experiences and genes and whatnot, which are going to be different for everybody. And this, on the one hand, there's, you can sort of fall into a sense of thinking of society as a collection of disintegrated individuals, but you also can see that when the appearance of uniformity actually occurs in the context of tremendous diversity. Even in a situation where you think everybody is the same, or everyone is in the same category of person, however you're making up categories of person, even a group of 3 people selected specifically for being the most similar to each other are going to be different from each other. So there's always a continuum beneath the category. And especially if and if we think about disability in general, or if we're thinking about disability in terms of large populations, the individual personalities of those people kind of get washed out in the mass of the data. But when we think about disability on an individual level, it's not only it is both a cause and an effect of how their personality develops. Somebody who has, I don't know, ADHD, for example, will grow up into a different person than they would have been if they didn't have ADHD. It's part of who you are.
Thank you. If I may quickly smuggle in a couple of questions I had. One is, it's about, again, these are broad methodological questions to some extent. The first one is about phenomenology as a kind of field as well as a method in some sense, and how you think medical examination of the body or medical analysis of the body, or a sort of medicalized approach, let's say, to the question of the body in literature uh, can be enriched through phenomenology if we look at the phenomenological sort of
Yeah.
ramifications on the body. That's the first question I have.
So I'm actually glad you asked that, because I have a chapter in Agony for Others that basically is about that question. It's specifically, it's about Margaret Edson's play Wit, which is the one about that English professor who dies of cervical cancer. Lovely, happy text that you read while writing a book about pain. But I specifically talk about this as an analysis of clinical hermeneutics. And I'm specifically using Gadamer and Levinas's concept of the face of the other to sort of talk about the process of diagnosis as a hermeneutic act, as a way of interpreting information, and this sort of iterative process of you take in the information from the text, you make what Gadamer refers to as a fore projection of here's what I think it is, then you get new information, you adjust, you iterate, you adjust your fore perception, and it's sort of like a scientific hypothesization, but it's also understood as a reading process that iterates and you sort of adjust and adjust. And what's important here is that the patient must be remembered to be also a reader of their own body. And how they read their own body is important not only for the diagnostic process. If someone's showing up at the hospital saying, hey, I've got a weird pain somewhere, that is an interpretation that they have made of their own body. And that's what gets them to the hospital, and that's what gets, then they say the problem is here. And the doctor's like, oh, it's your appendix. I don't know why I keep using the appendix as an example, but whatever. So that's one thing, but also, and this is why wit is very important, the patient's psychological well-being also depends on how they are interpreting their own body, which will be affected by the way that their doctors talk to them. You know, you have a weird lump somewhere and you go to a clinic and the doctor says, and you say, what is this? Really what you're saying is this cancer or not cancer? Right. And if the doctor says, I have no idea what it is, then you start freaking out. But if the doctor says, I have no idea what it is, but it's not dangerous, then you relax. Right. Your interpretation of your body may have different, and you may have different priorities in the doctor. Doctor wants to know scientifically, what is this thing so I can apply a cure and do X, Y, and Z. You're thinking that's important to you, but you're also thinking about, like, you know, I've got to take my kids to school, or I play a sport, or I have a job, or I'm worried about my well-being, or I'm worried about how this is going to affect me for personal, emotional, spiritual reasons. And so my answer then is that phenomenology is very important for understanding this process of mutual interpretation of the same body. And an interpretation, you know, and and also in terms of how you bring in your different epistemic positions. You know, a doctor's gone to medical school, sure, but you're the only person who feels your feelings. You know, the doctor may know more about you, more than you about how pain works, but they still have to say, okay, where does it hurt? To, you know, put it in a very simplified sense. So I guess my answer is that it's very important for a lot of reasons.
That's a great answer. It makes me think about medical diagnosis in that sort of hermeneutic way, as you just sort of showed. I have one last question, but I'll just reserve it for a while and see if there's a question from the floor. Is there a last question from the floor that we could take? Is there anyone who wants to ask another question? Please go ahead if you want. You could unmute yourself and speak, or you could put it in the chat box. Okay, I guess I could ask my last question then, if there's no more questions from the floor. So it's again perhaps a broad question, but it might give us a better idea in some sense of the literary readings in your book, right?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking what modernism specifically, and maybe to be more specific, Irish modernism, what does it do to this, again, this sort of disability studies approach to the body in literature? Because of course, I mean, one could see this in other literary periods too, but there's clearly something that you have in mind with Irish modernism and modernism in two different scales. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, sure. And I mean, yes, you could write a version of this book that uses a different literary field because I'm talking about, or a different era or location, because I'm talking about disability in general, and disability exists everywhere, basically. But, you know, modernism specifically, and Ireland specifically, is very fascinating, not only because the modernist period was this explosion of new techniques and new interests in representing subjectivity and representing the relationship between the mind and the body, you know, in ways that, you know, it's one of the reasons why the period is interesting, is that it's doing this in a way that has not been done, at least not within European literature, really in any kind of way, except for like Tristram Shandy. But also, the modernist period in Ireland was kind of a mecca of disability. You've got Ireland, Dublin had this is from a book by Maud Ellman, which I think The Nets of Modernism, that's what it is. And she, it had the lowest lifespan of any of the major European cities at the time. You've got outbreaks there's this laundry list of diseases she gives. You've got the after effects of the famine and of this sort of continuing colonization and oppression of the people there. And also you've got World War I, you've got the Irish Civil War, you've got the Easter Rising, which are all disabling events that disabled people or just threatened people with disability or made people more aware of their weakness and vulnerability. If there are guns going off outside your house, you're suddenly much more aware of the fact that a bullet would do horrible things to your body. So in one sense, there's just a lot to work with in modernist Ireland if you're interested in disability, and also way too little work that's been done there so far.
Right.
And on top of that, you've got Joyce and Beckett, who are just important modernists for representing the body, period. If I did a book that was just modernism and disability and didn't talk about Joyce and Beckett, people would say that it's incomplete.
Yeah.
I guess, it's one of the way I wrote the book is that I decided to pick an author for each chapter and then use it as a case study for a different angle that I wanted to take on the matter. So, for example, Elizabeth Bowen, who was an Anglo-Irish aristocrat and is sort of the settler colonial element of this process. She lived through the sort of disintegration of that and represents it in her novels, specifically The Last September, which is about the Irish Civil War, and it's about these sort of aristocrats who are in their fancy little house watching the things kind of go to shit outside and really hoping that their giant fancy house doesn't get burned down, as many of them did. This is a really interesting representation of the way that the control and manipulation of the politics and architecture of a space relates to the construction of the colonizer subject as an abled subject, and the colonized subject as disabled and therefore biased and untrustworthy. There's a lot of valuable overlap to be made between post-colonial theory and disability theory, of which I've only just begun to scratch the surface. But that's more or less what I was using Bowen for.
That's fascinating. I mean, scientific modernity and disability, and also the historical specificity of Ireland. And the last point that you made about Elizabeth Bowen also makes me think about the Big House novel in Irish literature and how it could be sort of seen in tandem with something like a medical humanities approach.
Exactly. I read Castle Rackrent in the process of researching that chapter. Last September is a Big House novel. Her book, Bowen's Court, which is basically this giant biography of her family's big house, Bowen's Court. She also wrote an essay called Bowen's Court. So the distinction between, italicizing and putting in quotation marks, very important for that chapter making sense.
Right. Right. No, that's great. That's great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I think we have already taken a lot of your time. But is there a question? Is there another?
Hello.
Yeah. Bikram, go ahead. Yeah.
So, I have a question regarding the. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Regarding, when you end your talk, you talk about how Joseph Conrad Kurtz, considered, his, able-bodied and his colonial project, and how, self-deception, function, in cards. So, my question is regarding how self-deception function in the construction of able-body and the the ability, and how the self-deception actually function in the discourse of power and powerful. So like the able people, who think of their able body and ignore of the disabled people. And the same way, the powerful, I mean, those who hold the power, I mean, through their self-deception, I mean, ignore the powerless people. So how this power, I mean, self-deception function in ableism and in power discourse. So if you can elaborate, like master-slave discourse.
Sure. And I'll just say for the record, I am not perhaps as up on the intricacies of the Modi government as perhaps I would need to be to answer that part of the question appropriately, but to speak sort of in a more general sense, one of the ways that power works is by substituting the leader for the group being led. So the classic example would be King Louis saying, "L'État est moi," the state is me. And that's basically, you know, like that's essentially what Mussolini said. That's essentially what any kind of, you know, authoritarian, that's what Trump says. And there's this, first, there's this idea that humans are fungible, that a person can legitimately stand in for another person, or that a person can stand in for a group, can represent that a group in like a literal material sense, which I think emerges from a concept of the body as idealized as non-local, as idealized as non-specific. You know, if the king is a specific limited individual who puts his pants on one leg at a time like everybody else, then how can he represent the state? But if the king is some kind of, you know, ideally abled body, and, you know, you have plenty of, you know, there's all kinds of anxiety in these sorts of autocratic organizations around, like, is the king sick? Is the king disabled? Oh, you can't take the throne and if you've got a bodily imperfection or that kind of thing. Which I think plays into this sort of diaphanous fungibility that autocrats take advantage of in order to localize decision-making power in themselves, and make themselves the sort of arbiter of what counts as truth intersubjectively. That's an excellent.
Thank you. Okay, so I think this is a good point for us to end. And thank you, Jeremy, once again for giving us the time. It was a pleasure to hear you.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully, we'll see each other soon. Bye-bye.
Have a nice
Bye.